we actually see this actually hold true even in society. These truths that they say in Proverbs. So I'm just going to read a couple, and I want us to reflect before we go into Ephesians. In Proverbs 23:24 it says, "The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who begets a wise son will be glad in him." In Proverbs 27:11 it says, "Be wise, my son, and make my heart glad." Proverbs 29:3 says, "A man who loves wisdom makes his father glad." Proverbs 3:11 and 12, "My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe his reproof. From whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father, the son in whom he delights." Proverbs 10:13, it says, "But a rod is for the back of him who lacks understanding." Proverbs 19:18, it says, "Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death." Proverbs 22:15, "Foolishness is bound up in the heart. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him." Proverbs 23:13 and 14. This is one of my favorites. "Do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you beat him with the rod, he will not die." He'll tell you he's dying. "Oh, I'm dying. Oh. Ah." I remember, man. Sorry. "You shall beat him with a rod. You shall beat him with a rod, and deliver his soul from Sheol." Proverbs 29:17. "Correct your son," and I'm going to imply your daughter as well. "Correct your son or daughter, and he will give you comfort. He will also delight your soul." Proverbs 19:15, on the other hand, says, "The rod and reproof give wisdom, but the child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother." Here's ultimately what that Proverbs is teaching us about parenting. We have a choice. We can either discipline our children, or we can just neglect them and let them do whatever they want. And with both choices, there are consequences. There are consequences where we can either look at them and be proud of them and look at them as a blessing, or they can be a shame to us, like it says in Proverbs 19:15. We can raise them up to be a blessing, or we can raise them up, or I guess the lack of raising them up, and they become a burden. See, the whole purpose of having children and being able to raise them up correctly is being able to delight how they grow up. And I'm sure there's grandparents here that are very proud of how they raise their children, because they raise children that love God, and they raise their children, their grandchildren, to love God. And I'm sure a lot of you are very proud of them. I think of my mom and how she raised our family. And, it's always reciprocating the way that, our family takes care of my mom. Like my sister, she always goes and visits my mom. And they always go out and hang out. And I'm sure if my mom never took care of my sister, my sister probably wouldn't want to hang out with her. Because she's kind of weird anyway. Both. And so, the way you raise your kids will come back to haunt you. They could be, like I said, a burden or a blessing. So let's read our text today. And I'm going to start from verse 1 in chapter 6, where it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you, and you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." So 2 weeks ago, we studied verses 1 through 3, and we looked at the responsibilities of the children. We looked at how the children are supposed to obey and honor their parents. Obedience outward, honoring from the inside. And so they know now that that's what children are supposed to be doing. And then Paul, then he kind of just turns around and starts talking to parents. And he says, he turns his attention to dads, and he applies it really to both parents, not necessarily just fathers, but there is a sense of I guess, of primacy in the father being the father figure. So he turns and he starts giving them instruction. And so as parents, I want us to really listen. And I need us to take this responsibility of being a parent seriously. We can't just neglect everything that's just being said. And as children, you guys have an opportunity to keep your parents accountable too. So just throw that out there. But the first thing Paul does, I want to look at 4 things that Paul does here. The first thing Paul does is to warn us of what not to do. He gives a warning of what not to do. Paul tells us to avoid something. And I'm going to read the verse again. He says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children." The ESV says, "Do not provoke your children to anger." So the first thing Paul does is he sets these limitations. He says, yes, you're going to discipline your child, but the first thing he does is he sets these limitations, and he makes it known that one, we are under the authority of God still, as far as how we raise our children. We can't just raise them the way we want to raise them, but we're under authority, and he says there's a limit. Do not exasperate your child. Do not provoke your child to anger. And what we are about to see in terms of our responsibilities is that they are exercised. They are to be exercised and to be consistent with the way that our God does his discipline. So with this warning, God limits us and our authority over our children by reminding us not to exasperate our kids. So as we fulfill our obligation, we need to fulfill them according to what Scripture has to say. Now, along with this, it also tells us to be mindful. It teaches us to be mindful of how our kids respond to our discipline. And I think a lot of times we tend to ignore that. We kind of just go, okay, well, this is the clear-cut way that I have to do. So bam, 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 bam. Okay, that's a lot. It's a little too much. So we hit, we rear our child, or we do whatever we need to do, and we kind of sometimes ignore how they respond to our discipline. And I think it's very important why we need to realize, the whole reason why Paul writes this. When you think of Roman society, which Paul was writing to, because Ephesus was in Roman society, they practice what they call patria potestas. And I don't know how to pronounce that properly, but it basically means the father's power. And what that meant was that in that society, the father had absolute power over his children. He had absolute power over his children. That means without any adjudication, he could, he didn't have to go to court. He could sell any member of his children, any one of his children. He could make them work in the field, chained if he wanted to. He could